if the wireless technology existed 20, 30 years ago to do what we're doing, like there's no way the internet would have been set up like this. One antenna can provide coverage
Right.
to 250,000 households with just 10 grand. You cannot even come close to doing that with a fiber technology.
So internet bandwidth, I think is what you're saying, is is a commodity with deflationary pricing, and Moore's law applied to connectivity means that, the cost of a megabit keeps dropping.
Solana has always been the home for DePIN. Always had a strong track record, strongest of any other chain, of supporting DePIN, and everything else is just a distraction.
Neil, it's great to have you on Unblock'd. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here and looking forward to getting to Dawn and all things DePIN.
Amazing. Well, I mean, you set up Andrena in 2016, I think partly in response to the FCC's net neutrality repeal. And you also founded Dawn, which is a decentralized autonomous wireless network. Perhaps you could just tell us about both of these projects and what they're about.
Yeah, so Andrena was my attempt to try to solve the problem of the internet being not perfect, really, with my own two hands. And I think when we say the internet's not perfect, I mean, we kind of all know that one way or another, whether we're paying exorbitant prices, whether we don't have good speed, whether we're being spied on, whatever that is. I think the internet, I always viewed it as kind of, one of the marvels of humanity. It's kind of what allows us to be connected to each other in ways that we couldn't before, right? Like it's a uniquely human machine. And I have always looked at it as something that I thought needed to be better, needed to be fixed, it needed to be cheaper, faster, just more secure. And in my mind, when I was, just a young engineer, I was looking at what I wanted to do with my life, and I very quickly fell in love with wireless because the potential of what wireless technology did, it really captured my inspiration in a way like none other. And the reason that was the case is because if you could communicate to people over the air instead of actually having cables that are in the way, you can do some really powerful things. And as we've kind of discovered, it really helps the economics of that thing, right? Is if you're miles away and I can have a high speed internet connection with you just using wireless devices, it's just much cheaper than just running a cable between us two, right? It's kind of pretty easy to understand. And Andrena was started with Princeton University. Actually, we built wireless infrastructure on top of their rooftops and started spanning that out towards their campus and then the surrounding area. And that was me, like I said, Andrena, starting to try to tackle this problem by my own two hands. I said, internet needs to be fixed. I'm inspired by how wireless can be like a way to actually do this. Let me go do this with my own two hands and become an internet service provider. So we would compete against, Comcast, Verizon, and we still do. It's a core part of what we still do, and we've grown that to now providing internet to over 20,000 households across 10 different states in the U.S. So it's been a huge honor to be able to just tackle this problem with my own two hands and trying to solve this on its own. But then I think in 2024 there was a key piece of wireless technology that came out that was namely the ability for one antenna to talk to many antennas. So if I have one transmitter, I can send a signal to many people simultaneously at the speeds of fiber. And so when you can have that be the case where one person or one node can talk to many people at the same time at speeds that are comparable to what they're getting today in the market, that was in my mind a huge unlock for when you could start actually going about this in a decentralized network. And that was really when we started Dawn, was built under this mission of now that the wireless technology has gotten good enough to really scale, how do you actually solve this problem worldwide all at once? And in this case of, Dawn versus Andrena, and Andrena, I'm limited by my own two hands, my ability and my team's ability to go out and build a physical network. But in the case of Andrena, or in the case of Dawn, when you start thinking about technology that is decentralized, that has incentives behind it, now you can really enable anyone around the world to go build networks with you under the same motto, the same mentality, all to really be able to provide, again, cheaper, faster, more secure internet to everybody. So those are the two mandates, right? Andrena as an entity that builds physical networks itself, and Dawn as a technology stack that incentivizes the building and the coordination of networks at scale.
Gotcha. So they're kind of complementary to each other, would you say?
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say, Andrena is, is kind of not only the labs entity for Dawn, so we do a bunch of the technology and R&D for Dawn, but we also are kind of the first guinea pig for a lot of the technology that Dawn puts out there, right? My objective for everything that we build at Side Dawn is to demonstrate, hey, look how easy it is. Look how we can generate a good financial return. Look how we can build a really cool network and provide a meaningful utility to the world by the technology that Dawn has enabled. And that I think has been kind of the recursive go to market that we've taken. So yeah, it really is like, again, just a labs entity and then also a guinea pig for the technology to bring it live.
Got it. And how many people are using the Dawn network?
Right now, we have those 20,000 households that are using it. We have around coverage of around 4 million households, a little bit more now, but that's the public number we're going with at the moment. Around 4 million households all across the US and in Ghana and Latin America as well. So network continues to grow every day. And, we're excited about the opportunity to continue providing more service to people across the world.
Amazing. And how have you ended up like focusing on the countries that you just mentioned?
So the country focus is quite an interesting one because we have prioritized areas primarily where there's a big discrepancy between pricing at the retail level versus the wholesale level. And this is, I think, the unique value prop that wireless offers. It's the ability to be able to buy internet at one location where it's cheap and seamlessly beam it to many other locations where it's expensive. And if that's the case, then you can essentially provide internet at a fraction of the cost to the other alternatives that are out there. And I think what's interesting is in any really it doesn't even have to be just a Western country, right? There's countries all across the world that have had a huge explosion of internet connectivity, mainly through mobile phones, right? It's mobile phones that have spawned so much growth of infrastructure, that has primarily started at the wholesale level. So it's kind of all of the data centers, right? And now with obviously the growth of things like AI, the entire data center has become this sort of like wholesale port or hub for the entire digital economy in a given market. And these are all areas that we know have a really good data center presence. So we know we can go there and get internet for really cheap or work with other people that get internet for really cheap and then broadcast that signal very far and wide to cover a lot of people. So that's been our core MO is just find areas where we can use wireless to beam internet from one source to another, where we can buy it for very cheap and it's very expensive in other areas, and then use that to be able to provide a better service to people in the surrounding area.
Gotcha. So if I have internet and I'm not using it, I can connect to the Dawn network and sell my surplus bandwidth.
That's correct. Yeah. And that's been like, again, and that's been a part of a two-pronged strategy. So on one side, we have been primarily working with like data centers and operators that have access to the data centers. But as we continue to focus more on the retail side of stuff, and we'll be coming out with the small retail product that can't announce at this point yet, but it does exactly what you're saying. And a good example is like I do that today in my home, right? At my home, I live in a 4 unit apartment building, and my three other neighbors are all piggybacking off of one internet connection we have. And we're using the same wireless technology to be able to broadcast this to all my neighbors. So the nice part about that is that one internet bill is now being split in four ways. So I've have a much cheaper utility bill as a result of actually doing a model like this.
Definitely. I mean, you mentioned the data centers was the initial and sort of use case. Was that for sharing storage space and processing?
No, the data centers are actually for because the data centers is not only where you'll find AI clusters, you'll GPU clusters, you'll find storage clusters. That's where also all of the big fiber companies. So the subsea fiber optic cables that interconnect continents that run along the coastlines and interconnect major cities. They also eventually land in these data centers. So if you want to buy data for very cheap, that's where there's just an abundance of it. So those are the locations where we'll work with local operators to set up connections at these data centers, and then we'll use the rooftops of those data centers to broadcast that signal far and wide. So in the case of you and me, like if me sharing with my neighbors or if you wanted to share with your neighbors, that is a great way in which we can provide a meaningful impact and actually even make money on our internet bill if we wanted to. But working with operators at data centers is how you take that model and crank it up to the next level where you can cover, not just tens of people in your neighborhood, you can cover hundreds of thousands of people off of a couple of rooftops.
Got it. So the model in your house is more like C to C, and the data center to consumers is more B to C. Would you say?
That's correct. Yeah, it's well said.
Got it. And so basically you're turning internet bandwidth into a commodity where anyone can like produce and sell connectivity, kind of like a last mile marketplace, would you say?
Correct. And I know this is one thing that we wanted to talk about at some point, but the parallels for the solar panel analogy have always been a big source of inspiration for me as I've thought about this. Because I've always just loved the idea that somebody could just throw up solar panels on top of their roof and get sovereignty back over their own utility. And the funny thing about this is like utilities are the kind of stuff that like are just the base essentials for life, right? Like there's so much rich color to life that comes from utilities, right? And we just want this kind of base infrastructure primitive layer to work. And the idea that the scientists created this new type of technology, solar panels, that anybody can just throw up and get access to power, it's kind of a beautiful concept. And I have seen that and I said, "Hey, what is really required for people to be able to do the same thing with wireless?" And that's been kind of the MO that we've been following here. So I'd say that has been the kind of like a source of the inspiration by far. It's just allowing people to take back control of their own infrastructure because the technology finally allows people to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of analogies between like the work we've been doing at PowerLedge with electricity, but it's via cables, as you point out. And the distinction, I think, is that you're using wireless, which makes it somewhat easier. But I think, notwithstanding, you also operate in a really heavily regulated space. Um, could and one thing we noticed is that there's often a gap between where the technology is and where the regulatory conversation is. How has your conversation been in that regard?
Yeah, I'd say fortunately, ever since really 2023, but then again, the technology started coming to market in 2024 and 2025. The regulatory space has not, I wouldn't say necessarily caught up enough to really be where we want, but it's at a point where it's not a bottleneck towards growth. And the reason is because in the case of wireless, the major unit of, the unit that is regulated is typically spectrum, right? It's the airwaves that we can actually talk on. And the airwaves are everything from low frequency waves that go really long distances but can travel very far, all the way to high frequency waves that are very short, can pack a lot of data into it, but can only go short distances. And the nice part about this is the FCC and the whole world has followed suit as a result of the FCC, as the introduction of Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7 has actually introduced more spectrum for unlicensed operators to be able to work with. So if you're just a random Joe Schmo and you want to be able to deploy a high capacity interconnection, the FCC and the rest of the world has actually made it easy to do so, specifically on a chunk of those airwaves called 6 gigahertz of spectrum. And that 6 gigahertz of spectrum is released more unlicensed spectrum than we've actually ever seen in our entire lifetime. And the last time that the FCC, has given us the spectrum has led to the creation of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And that's just like a fascinating thing to consider is that wireless airwaves that the government has given or regulation has given to people like us to be able to build has led to the creation of technologies that meaningfully changed our lives, like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth.
Yes.
And so now we've had, over double that amount of spectrum given back to us, and the technology and orchestration is just catching up. Like, what do we do with this? How do we really take this spectrum to really connect us all in a better way? And this is, I think, one of the key core niches that the Dawn protocol aims to solve. And as we build this protocol and bring it out there, it's really saying, hey, everybody has access to now this incredibly valuable piece of spectrum. How do we orchestrate it and coordinate it to build a new internet superhighway using this wireless technology? So I'd say, fortunately, I can't point the finger at anybody like the regulatory environment and say, hey, you guys are stopping us from going too slow. Maybe on the crypto side, but that's a completely different story. I'd say from the purely physical side of things, we're actually in a really good spot. And I'd say it's now about the imagination of protocol builders and designers about how do you take that spectrum and orchestrate its coordination at a massive scale to really be able to build a new internet for people. And to give you a practical example of what this looks like, is that if you wanted to be able to have a small device in your home and share a gigabit, right, fiber level speeds directly to your neighbor, for example, it would be virtually impossible to do that without 6 gigahertz of technology. So you would never have the ability to do that. So the idea of people sharing internet connections at gigabit levels of speed, we got that ability thanks to 6 gigahertz of spectrum. We didn't have enough physical spectrum to be able to do that beforehand. So now it's actually a very unique opportunity to be able to really scale a model like this.
Gotcha. What regulation kind of preceded all of this? And you're saying it's like the availability of bandwidth in one respect, but what about, for example, the 1996 Telecom Deregulation Act? How important was that for setting the scene for all of these other things that followed suit?
I'd say it definitely wasn't as important in that case. I mean, in that scenario, that was, more in terms of how bigger operators were able to work in these markets. I would say the biggest case for us, or the biggest example, is definitely by far the spectrum. But then I'd say, actually, kind of what I pointed to earlier, the biggest, if you have the ability to be able to broadcast speeds that are, high capacity, it was really the growth of the wholesale market that we owe the biggest thanks to. So, ever since in the similar time in the 90s, there was such a big investment into dark fiber, and data centers got so interconnected as a result of doing that. So there's so much extra surplus supply that internet eventually became very cheap to be able to buy in these key strategic locations. So I'd say the two biggest things that we owe our potential to, it's one, it's the availability of new spectrum, and it's the growth of wholesale internet capacity. And those two things, I think, are what are the key prerequisites you need to be able to build a new user powered.
What extent was wholesale internet capacity catalyzed by the Telecommunication Deregulation Act? Because I understood that was how like lots of small ISPs could set up readily and become providers, and that's how a whole lot more competition came into the space. Uh,
Yeah, that is, I think, something that definitely benefited something like Andrena, right? I was approaching it from the dog perspective. From the case of Andrena, yeah, something like that was a huge opportunity that allowed individual people to be able to actually go out and build this thing. But the challenge that we need to face is what's the kind of gap in the middle by which an individual person can actually sell internet capacity without actually having to be like a regulated entity, like doing a 477 filing, for example, with the FCC. So I guess to your earlier question about regulation, this is probably one of the areas that will probably have to be expanded upon the most, is what does it actually take to further deregulate it such that an individual person could participate versus an individual versus like a corporation, for example. So I say definitely has helped like individual upstarts that are looking to disrupt here. But as we consider what is needed for the individual, there's a couple of more areas that we need to go deeper into.
Gotcha. But for like organizations such as yourself, there's no recent regulatory change. It's more advancement in technology that's led to the emergence of these decentralized networks.
Correct. Yeah, and it's been purely like I wish when you've been in the industry for a while, you kind of get a sense of all of the different technology building blocks you have to be able to deliver high capacity. And there's kind of like a chart that you have in your mind about like on the x-axis is like performance, and on the y-axis is price. And you can just kind of see that that curve has just been dropping, dropping, dropping. As I kind of think about like 802.11 BGN technology versus AC technology, and now AX and BE technology. There's all of these different product lines of technology that have essentially just become higher capacity with new spectrum and just cheaper over time. And I mean, that has been kind of the big unlock for all of us.
I mean, as a lead in or response to that comment, like many people think that their ISP is expensive and that the telcos are greedy. And uh, you've, kind of argued that the problem is structural in this three-tier system of, fiber, backhaul, the regional distribution, the last mile. Like, w- what do you think of that kind of assertion that retailers are being overcharged, and actually and you did start the conversation by saying the delta between the wholesale price and the retail price is the sweet spot for you, presumably because there's more money to be made on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as much as I think they are being greedy, I think they also have a financial imperative to be greedy. But I also think that when you look at the returns that you get on fiber, the yields have been compressed on that, and it's also very expensive. So you can kind of understand why somebody that's like under the gun for recouping a massive infrastructure investment would charge as much as they can. Right? It's I don't think AI data centers are going to be any different from that. Like, where we're going to kind of see what happens when yields get compressed very quickly. But in the case of like fiber companies, it's like, dude, it's just expensive to put cable on the street, right? You need to rent bucket trucks, you need to have giant spools, you need to call the police in to be able to close off streets for you. Like that, think about doing that operation for hundreds of thousands of homes, even in a suburb, right? Like that kind of stuff gets pretty expensive. And so, kind of to what we've talked before is like, if the wireless technology existed 20, 30 years ago to do what we're doing, like there's no way the internet would have been set up like this. Like there's no way it would have been set up like this. And so now we're just realizing like, hey, now that we have the technology just made good, what's a better and cheaper way for people to be able to do that? And so I think the key distinction that I make towards all of this is when you're operating with laying cables, there's two real things that or bottlenecks or constraints that you have. One is you need massive level of scale and penetration. And so if you're looking at like fiber companies that are out there, the ones that do well, no surprise, are the ones that have lots of customers. But the point being is that when you invest that money into running that cable, you're under the clock. You have the time is against you to be able to get as many customers as you can, or you're not going to be able to repay your debts for that initial fiber that you laid. And so that entire phenomena really kind of starts putting telecommunications in like a 3 to 5 year payback window, right? So if you think about when I'm investing versus when I get my money back, it's a 3 to 5 year time horizon. And what's interesting about wireless is that if you do it well and you focus on the right business models and you don't necessarily overbuild, you're in a scenario where your payback period goes from 3 to 5 years to now 1 to 2 years. And that I
Wow.
think is when things get quite interesting and you start thinking about how does financialization of these sorts of networks open up because the payback periods are different from what they used to be. And that, to your original question, is the structural difference here. Is now you're in a scenario where payback periods have come down massively. It's really just a question of what the right way is to scale this. And I think those are some of the challenges that we're going to be answering over the next couple of years as an industry as a whole.
What's the reason why the payback periods have changed so dramatically?
The payback periods have changed so much dramatically because to be able to so that it comes down to that initial investment. So if I wanted to be able to provide coverage to a whole city, think about it from the perspective of the provider. There's really two things you're doing. One is you're running kind of the skeletal framework of the fiber network, right? I'm running fiber throughout all of the cities, throughout the city, throughout the streets. Maybe I'm putting them in a couple of big buildings, right? You're building up the backbone. But when you build up the backbone, that's not customers, right? Once you build out the backbone, then you need to branch that out towards actually activating individual people. And so what the difference is that initial investment of building the backbone throughout all of the cities, there is no customers associated with that, and it's incredibly expensive. And so the way to quantify that really comes down to what's the cost to in the telecommunications industry. The jargon for is passing a home. And so if you look at the cost to pass a home, which means that I'm just running some connectivity source by you, that doesn't mean that you've activated. It doesn't mean that you're a customer. It just means that now your home is eligible for service. The cost to be able to do that in the case of fiber versus wireless is literally 50 to 100x more expensive for fiber versus wireless. And that is really the difference of where the payback period comes in. Is to think about it this way, I wish I could screen share and show everybody on this. That would be my best case scenario. But like we have an individual building in Brooklyn, for example, where a single antenna that costs $10,000 is able to provide coverage to 250,000 households, right? And that I think is an example of the power of wireless. One antenna can
Yeah, that's
provide coverage
great.
to 250,000 households with just 10 grand. You cannot even come close to doing that with a fiber technology. And so that just goes to show you how creating that initial coverage is the reason purely why the initial ROI or why the ROI in general has gotten so much better.
Yeah, that's an important like soundbite to kind of put the scale of cost and the scale of reach in context. Thank you. And so internet bound, I think is what you're saying is like a commodity with deflationary pricing, and like thinking about like Moore's law applied to connectivity means that the cost of a megabit keeps dropping. N- And how do you using blockchain technology, like how do you build a token economy on top of an underlying good that keeps getting cheaper?
I would say it's a really good question too, and it's one that I don't always know the answer to. And to be just frank about this sort of stuff is you'll see it right now, like Google Fiber. They ended up merging with Astound literally last week. Fiber is just incredible for doing high speed connections, and we're just going to give people a lot and charge them a lot. Like for example, like they have like 3 gigabit per second connections, but you and I recording this individual connection, it only takes 5 megabits per second, right? Less than like less than 0.5% of what that overall capacity that we have is. And so the interesting thing is we haven't really seen these household use cases for data that is on the order of like gigabits per second, right? Like you're even when you're downloading a file and you're downloading a file from work or you're downloading a game to play, you're never in a scenario where this end server that you're contacting and trying to stream that content from is really ever over a couple hundred megabits per second. So I'd say at the high level, I actually don't know how connectivity is going to shape up over the long period because I haven't seen that killer demand case for households that is just going to continuously drive up demand. I think that way, like like if you imagine like 4K video, right? Even that's a good example. That's 25 megabits per second, and 8K. I don't know. I think that's like 50 or 75 megabits per second. We haven't really seen those apps that are driving that massive level of user demand. So in the long term, unless we have like some interesting VR, AR technology that takes gigabits per second that everybody wants to utilize, it's actually hard to know what is going to be like over the long run. It's the same thing with water, right? Like we're not necessarily in a scenario where like I have an application like every household is deploying like a hydroponic setup and has like a massive demand for household water, right? Like it kind of gets to some point and then tapers off. And maybe that will be the same thing for connectivity. Maybe that won't be the same thing for connectivity because you'll start seeing examples of like AI use cases, right? Maybe we're going to see a world where as AI and robotics continues to run our lives more and more, that demand for that pipe to get bigger is going to be there. So I'd say at a macro demand level, we'll see how the industry evolves. But what I'll say to your question about the token economy side of stuff, the reason why there is still so much work to be done is because only a small fraction of the world actually has that truly unlimited bandwidth that they need for all of the demand applications. People are still overpaying for a lot and are underserved in terms of their capacity all across markets all over the world. And we're talking not like millions of people, we're talking billions of people still have bad connectivity service. So I'd say it's easy for us, especially, you're where you're calling from, you probably also have pretty good internet, right? I'm calling from Princeton. I have pretty good internet too. I mean, I'm biased, we're using Andrena, but the point being is the internet here is pretty good. And I think we oftentimes forget how many people across the world are just lacking. And so you can create $1 trillion business literally just by bringing the rest of the world up to speed on where folks like you and me are today. So there's just a huge opportunity to be created still.
So in terms of like tokenomics, notwithstanding like the deflationary kind of characteristics, uh, have you got a token model that you could that you've developed that you could talk about, Neil?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot we can say about the token side of stuff. So I'd say, in my opinion, in order for a token model to be able to work, you need to have some level of value that flows to it and that can flow to it over the long time. Whether that's manifested as buybacks, burn, there's many different mechanisms that are to it. What I will say is that as long as an individual unit of infrastructure can realize an ROI and you can scale that through the deployment of average people participating in that, those are kind of the key ingredients that you need to be able to even make something like this. And so when you consider kind of, and if we get to like, we can talk more about tokenomics and crypto in general, but when you get to the kind of existing way of doing tokenomics models, I think we've seen this history in DePIN of like, hey, let's just inflate our token supply to be able to provide rewards to people as an incentive to be able to deploy network. And I think that works, but it doesn't work forever. And the reason why is because there's such a lagged and delayed response between investment and value accrual. And I think what folks like us, and I know there's a bunch of good examples we can talk about out there that are kind of tightening that model. So the time between you buying and holding a token and you getting a token for whatever activity you're doing and getting that reward is now getting a tighter time frame. And that I think is the essence of what it takes to build any good token, right? Any good token needs to give people a reason to hold it. And I think the harsh reality that, we've learned is, at least in DePIN ever since, October, I would say, is you have to have models that provide that strong value accrual mechanism to the underlying token holder. Otherwise, these assets are probably going to be the first thing that people look to sell in times of any bit of economic hardship. And this kind of comes back to maybe like a bigger point. It's like I've always wanted crypto to kind of be the anti-dollar, right? It's the kind of thing that when the dollar isn't doing well, crypto is doing well. But unfortunately, that's a little bit naive of me, and I don't think that's actually happened. So at the same time, we have to think about ourselves as like a proper asset class that people want to hold. Why would they want to hold it like they hold any other asset class? And this is all very high level, so maybe it doesn't answer your question specifically, but these are certainly the building blocks that I look towards as I consider the right types of tokenomics models that work. So now we can go wherever you want to go with that, but that's at least my opinion at a high level. I think what this entire idea of thinking is it applies, or I would like to think it applies a level of rigor towards the financial engineering side, but also the digital infrastructure side. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of crypto founders, at least in DePIN, haven't necessarily understand what can we learn from RWAs and tokenization that we should apply to our products to be able to scale them effectively. But I think folks like us, for example, are doing a great, or hopefully, I will be doing a great job of that. But then there's great sources of inspiration as I looked across from like USD for example, and Daylight, two really good examples of folks that are thinking about how do we tokenize the underlying unit of production rather than a whole nebulous network that is really hard to wrap your head around.
Gotcha. N with the internet sharing, is if you don't have enough internet, is there a supplier of last resort, or the the user just doesn't get all the internet it wants or needs?
I would say there isn't really a supplier last resort. It comes down to what is that level above you that you can always rely on. Like I've always, as we kind of talked about on the wholesale side, I always say that the wholesale data center is kind of that supplier, I guess, of last resort that always guarantees that you have enough. But if you're operating in like a rural area, for example, where you don't have a data center to work on, you might actually be in a tough spot. And that's actually where I've looked at like technologies like Starlink, for example, is like a huge source of inspiration for me because where we have a good model for Dawn in urban markets where you have access to data centers, you usually have access to enough capacity if you can get it, where there's plenty of options to buy from. So if I can't get enough, I can find somebody else that can get enough. But as we start to think about how Dawn can work in rural markets, there we actually have to rely on a source like Starlink, for example. So you can
Mhm.
imagine a scenario where, like, in an emerging market where maybe like a town can't afford everybody can't afford an individual Starlink connection, you can see a world where somebody uses Starlink to grab a connection and then actually uses Dawn to terrestrially expand that. And that I'm very excited to be able to see more of that stuff come to life, because then you can kind of really scale the limitations of low Earth orbit networks, right? Like Starlink, for example. The key that I think is Starlink is like an incredible technology for coverage. Wherever you need to get connectivity, you can get that, but per Elon's own admission, it's not as good at densifying, right? That's why you kind of are going to need to have these heterogeneous networks like Starlink combined with Dawn, for example, to be able to provide this level of coverage in an interesting way. So I'd say to answer your question, urban markets definitely have that level of all you can always get some sort of surplus connectivity. Rural markets don't, but with technologies like Starlink and then also Amazon is now entering the landscape for low Earth orbit stuff, we're going to be in a scenario where you can always find a source of extra capacity if you need it.
Great. And so would you say that there's a focus for you in urban or rural areas? Like for this year, like what are your priorities?
Definitely in urban right now. I would say the satellite technology is still catching up in terms of the performance you need to be able to achieve the wildest dreams that we have for it. When you're in a scenario where we talked about before, when fiber has a 3 to 5 year payback period, but now wireless is a 1 to 2 year payback period. If you really have an asset class that has a level of financial performance, you got to figure out how to give exposure to the market for that. And I think that's going to be our key focus for this year. It's just demonstrating a level for people to get exposure to those underlying assets in a way that they couldn't before.
Yeah. And then how are you finding new customers? Like how are you targeting them and onboarding them?
Yeah, this is a fun one. I mean, it's a combination of our key bread and butter has been to work with people that can provide some level of scale. So the two folks of people that we've worked with have really been like apartment building owners and folks that are telecom operators. Those are kind of the two examples. So like one that I can talk about briefly about is in the New York area. We work with one of the housing authorities that's there. We actually have several housing authorities that are there. But the point being is they have the mandate of saying they want to provide affordable internet to their residents. So we work with them and their developers to bring in a cheap source of internet connection and then broadcast that to all of their neighbors using our technology. And something like that actually keeps it very cheap. It keeps it very performant, and it keeps it very open and not controlled by an individual entity. So there's a lot of interesting mechanics that are there about the original mission, right? The original mission has always been about cheaper, faster internet that is just more secure and benefits the underlying people. And so that we've been working with, like even on the government side, right? Just work with the local municipalities, work with the local housing authorities to be able to fulfill their mandate. That's been one type of customer that we've been working with, right? And the second type has been actually building owners themselves that actually want to be able to include internet as like a premium experience for their residents. So like I think that eventually we're going to get to the point where the internet is kind of just like tap water, where you can just move into an apartment and you know it's going to work and you know you're going to get exactly what you need to get. And so what we've been working with building owners is to build what we call our Dawn fabric system, which is just a fabric of connectivity throughout the entire building that allows the building owner to plug in and own that infrastructure, and then allows the residents to be able to tap into that as soon as they move in. And that's been kind of like a key part of our technology experience is like we just give a better internet experience in luxury apartment buildings and workforce buildings, really everything from like every residential type of building profile where people live. We want to provide a better internet experience for them. And the customers have ultimately been everybody from, housing authorities to multifamily developers. It's been a pretty wide range. And there's a lot of people that are, want to make sure that the people in their buildings have good internet.
Hmm. And do any of them know or care about that it's using blockchain or tokens?
No, I mean, I would say the savvy ones definitely do. The savvy ones are like, oh, this is interesting. Like, how do I get involved in something like this in a more interesting way? But at the end of the day, to your kind of question, everybody just wants the utility to work. So I'd say, by and large, most people don't actually care that the blockchain stuff is underneath the hood. I'd say if they realized what the blockchain stuff under the hood allowed them to achieve, I think things might be a little bit different. But there's such a barrier to entry for participating in this sort of stuff. So I would say that, focus on how to use a token to be able to provide a good service and, more good stuff will come from it.
And so, what would you say are the kind of key benefits of doing it on the blockchain as opposed to just centralized ledgers?
I'd say there's a couple of key things. Like if we look at, and this is you can say about any crypto project, right? What is the value that crypto brings to the equation? I'd say one is it allows people who don't know each other to work together for matters of both infrastructure and capital formation. And that I think is kind of the key that I would point to about why crypto, I think in general, if you can do it in the right way, fundamentally can benefit any business. Is that if you think about how do I bring capital formation to my ecosystem, to the builders that are using the technology that I have, and how do I be able to allow them to work together without knowing each other? And that's a very broad problem that doesn't just apply to telecommunications or anything. And so in our case, when I'm selling internet to my neighbors, for example, they don't what crypto allows, and it's really more cryptography as a whole, but crypto ledgers are kind of like the orchestration behind the scenes for that. When I'm selling internet to my neighbors, the entire technology stack allows them to have confidence that they're getting a good service without actually being able to rely on a central entity. And so I think centralized entities could adopt the same level of technology to give consumers that level of satisfaction. But for whatever reason, they don't prioritize that as a premium. And at the same time, blockchains are difficult enough as a technology stack to get into. So from our scenario, it just kind of obfuscates trust, and it means, or rather, it doesn't obfuscate trust. It kind of eliminates trust. Is that I don't need to trust you to be able to know
Eliminates
that
the
I'm
need for
getting a
trust.
good.
Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, blockchains really eliminate the need for trust. And in our case, the simple one is like, if I'm buying an internet connection directly from you and you're my neighbor, how do I know you have enough data to give me? And how do I know that I'm actually getting what you said that you'd be giving me? And these are kind of, again, a key primitive that you need to be able to solve for any supply chain network, right? Is in the whole point of a ledger system is to be able to remove trust from the equation about what are you giving me and what am I buying from you or what am I selling. And if you can kind of scale that to other types of resources, it's a quite a powerful model. That's on one side of the piece. The second side of the piece is on the capital formation side. And so this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, like at least in the case of like USDI and Daylight. Let's look at USDI, for example, right? In their case, they're able to
Just
provide.
for everyone's benefit, could you explain what they are?
Yes. So yeah, USDAI is a vault style system, or they call it a synthetic dollar, but it's a vault style system where you can deposit a stable coin into their vault and you will get access to the cash flows that come from GPU loans that they build. So they will write loans to people that say, hey, I want to go deploy a GPU cluster, but I'm not necessarily big enough to go to a bank. I want to deploy maybe $1 million, maybe $5 million, and build like a local mini data center to be able to sell AI capacity. USDAI will write you a loan, and then they will allow crypto to be able to get exposure to the cash flows that come from those loans. And that, I'd say, is like a unique example of capital formation. You have taken people that want to get yield and want to park their capital to get sort of access to yield, and you have taken crypto and you've taken their unique strategy of going out to small sub scale deployers and be able to pair those two together. And that, I think, is just a beautiful example of capital formation at work. So and we have seen those sorts of things with just the token in general, right? The token is a way in which it does the same thing, but that sort of integration layer has been more kind of like at a hope that the token goes up, versus something like USDI has set a clear expectation about what do you get from a return perspective by actually holding the token. And that, I think, in general is where DePINs are going to start to go more and more towards. So hopefully that answers that question.
Gotcha. And so, do you think that there's some complementary other products and services in blockchain and crypto that could be on ramps or shared funnels for on ramping or cross selling?
I would say if you view it from the token perspective, the answer is definitely yes. And what I mean by that is like every token, whether it's a DePIN token, whether it's a DeFi token, I think ultimately they all eventually become kind of the DeFi style tokens one way or another. And if you think about it as like, hey, these tokens represent economic rights in some capacity, the interesting things that you have to start asking to your question about how do you start getting like more cross pollination is how do you start using these economic rights for like borrowing and lending protocols? How do you use them for splitting out PT and YT, principal tokens and yield tokens, these mechanisms? So I'd say that's going to be, I think, the next frontier is sort of how RWA has been going here. So I'd say RWAs have been kind of, in my mind, like a key success story, and there's a lot of interesting things that come about from this sort of stuff. But we're going to start to see kind of like in the case of USDAI, DePIN becoming tokenized in a way that is more similar to what we are familiar with when we see RWAs. And you can see once you tokenize an underlying asset, like I said, there's a lot of cool things you can do to it, whether it's secondary markets, whether it's borrowing and lending, whether it's PT, YT splitting. There's a lot of cool mechanisms that can come from there. And that's really where distribution starts to happen.
Gotcha. So basically, what you're saying is these assets have a value and they could be used as collateral or invested in other parts of the ecosystem.
Correct. Yeah. Like, and in the case of like USDI is like another good example is you can have a little share of their vault and you're getting, your case like the 5 to 15% yield that they're hoping for from their vault. You can now go ahead and deposit that and use that as collateral to be able to get a loan for USDC to be able to go do whatever you want with that, right? Maybe you can go deploy that in, you can loop that back into USDI if you wanted to. You could go use that to buy another token, right? So I'd say these are the kinds of things that crypto is uniquely good for is they create liquidity for your underlying assets by just plugging you into so many different markets where people ultimately want what you have, right? I think that's really where things quite get interesting.
Gotcha. You built Dawn on Solana. Tell us about why you made that call.
Well, unfortunately, that was an easy call. It was an easy call and an early call in the day. And I think Solana has always been the home for DePIN, and I think Solana has taken such a massive interest in the tokenization of assets, and so as they kind of continue to focus more on RWAs, it's just kind of a no brainer for us as like a truly financial rails that allows us to really scale what we're trying to do. I remember, my two biggest decision factors at the other point is like I didn't want to think about layer twos and finality and all that kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, nowadays they've gotten a little bit better at that sort of stuff where it's obfuscated a little bit more. But the other piece too is I just wanted to have something that I knew would strongly support the underlying asset that we're bringing on chain. And Solana has always had a strong track record, strongest of any other chain, of supporting DePIN and physical infrastructure projects. And so I think as we are kind of seeing this next generation of tokenization of assets and what those financial profiles look like with RWAs, Solana is like right at the forefront to figure out how do they continue to scale their RWA efforts. So for me, it's been a no brainer. They have always adapted to the times where the markets are at, and they've seen the value of physical infrastructure, and they put their resources behind it.
Gotcha. And in terms of your focus for this year, it's growing? You said that you want to focus on cities. What are the other priorities for Dawn?
My priorities are simple right now. There's plenty I can say, but I can only unfortunately think one quarter ahead at a time as I build. But right now, my focus is purely how do I build more physical network? How do I demonstrate that 1 to 2 year payback period? And how do I give exposure to the market to that 1 to 2 year payback period?
Nice.
That is purely within my focus right now. Everything else is just a distraction.
Very clear. Very clear. While you're avoiding distraction, do you ever listen to music?
Yeah, yeah, all the time. Yeah.
Uh,
What's the
I was going
question
to
behind
ask
that?
you, like, what's your favorite song at the moment?
Okay, so honestly, it's funny. I didn't pick this mug for it, but my favorite. So the types of music that I like, I don't know. It's gonna sound kind of nerdy, but like my favorite type of music is program music that is not tied to something physical. And so what I mean by that is like my favorite album right now is something called The Spirit of St. Louis. So this is I didn't even think about this when I got this mug out, but this is my St. Louis mug. You can see the little Spirit of St. Louis over there. But it essentially is a guy called Adam Young that that ended up taking set like massive historic events like Ernest Shackleton's, The Endurance, right, or The Spirit of St. Louis, or the construction of Mount Rushmore, and he constructs a soundtrack to a historical event. And so the idea that you can kind of listen to an artist's interpretation of this historical event through the span of multiple different songs, I don't know. I've enjoyed listening to that, and there's no vocals, so it doesn't distract me from when I'm at work because I get pretty easily distracted by vocals when somebody's talking. And that's been my favorite album so far.
Amazing, very unique, and sounds a little bit analogous to the work that you're doing. Like, it's sort of abstraction, decentralization. Yeah,
Yeah, maybe, yeah, maybe when you're just a nerd. I mean, I don't know if I
and
think of myself
nerdy.
as a nerd. Yeah, maybe when you're nerdy, you kind of like more abstract level stuff. So we can chalk it up to that.
Yeah, I think this conversation to many would be very nerdy, but I really enjoyed it, Neil. And congratulations on all the things that you've been making with your two hands, as you mentioned a few times at the beginning of this conversation. And it's absolutely the case. And yeah, I look forward to seeing the growth of your network and all your activities over the coming months, and to have you on Unblock'd again in the future.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. There's a lot of kind of little secrets that I dropped that maybe I shouldn't have dropped, and maybe people will connect the dots about a couple of things. But looking forward to being back on next time. We're going to talk more about this and what it actually looks like from the real world perspective. So, thank you so much for having me on. It's been just truly a pleasure. Your questions have been really, really good. So, thank you again for the time and having the great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Take care.